Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. This morning, I'd like to introduce you to Raymond March. Ray is an assistant professor of economics at NDSU and a Challey Institute faculty scholar. Welcome, Ray.
Oh, good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And you do a lot of very interesting research that's related to health economics. I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about what kinds of questions do you aim to ask and answer with your research?
Yeah, so broadly what my research tries to uncover is what are the rules, regulations, institutions, and structures which allow for people to prosper. And prosperity could be better health, more longevity, more enjoyment out of life, more patient well-being. And I've taken a variety of approaches to do that. Most of my most recent research, I would say, is focusing on one particular drug called insulin. So, John, as you're aware, right, prices of insulin have gone up astronomically in the last couple of years, but really going back 10, 15 years, they've been steadily rising. And this creates a problem for diabetics, right? You have the type 1 diabetics who depend on insulin basically daily to live. But even then you have the larger group, the type 2 diabetics, who in recent years have been using a lot more insulin to control and manage their condition. But when the price of insulin goes sky high, they have to start making choices, right? Do I want to have more insulin and less food? Do I have to ration my medication to make sure I make it to the end of the month, which means you have higher blood sugars, which creates longer-term complications, making their life harder, making healthcare costs more expensive broadly. And I've been trying to uncover what is the reasoning behind that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think this is something that obviously a lot of people really care about. This is really important research. Could you talk a little bit more about the impacts that your research has on society?
My broad impacts are trying to uncover the questions of how do we get better outcomes for patients and how do we get a better functioning healthcare system. I would say I've examined a variety of areas. I've done diabetes management, I've studied mental health care, I've studied pharmaceutical regulations, and these are all very different, very complex problems involving potentially thousands of people. The healthcare industry is enormous in the United States, and especially now, right, it's all globally connected. But I would say the one fundamental lesson I'd like the readers of my research and the people who are trying to understand the healthcare system better to take home is that if you have more competition, you have better outcomes for everybody. And, I mean, for better or worse, that's been an aspect of markets, and especially in healthcare, that's been neglected considerably. And I really hope in the next several years, hopefully through my research and my writings, people can come to appreciate that a little bit more better and help create a better system.
Yeah, that's a really important message, great message. Could you just talk a little bit, just briefly, about your personal connection that you have with the issue of insulin? I think that's very interesting. I'd like just maybe talk about that.
Yeah, it's not just an academic pursuit. It affects me in my life. I'm a type 1 diabetic. I've been that way since I was 19. I'm now older than 19, so it's been an issue going on in my life for a while. And I've personally seen, right, through my own trying to manage my condition, through insulin shots and dieting, combinations thereof, it gets much, much, much harder when medication that I need for my personal health and my livelihood to become more expensive, and to try to switch between different insulins and to try to manage shots and to try to figure out how can I possibly adjust my diet while keeping my ratios of injections right. And it's been tough for me, right, especially in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, but I'm not special, right? There's millions of people who are diabetic. There's tens of millions of people who are type 2 diabetics who could benefit from insulin if it wasn't so gosh darn expensive, right? And, I mean, current healthcare trends are, I believe as of the next 10 years or so, most people are going to be diabetic or pre-diabetic, or that's a majority of people. So that's 100 million people who could benefit from this drug if it's affordable and if it's accessible, and current trajectory says that's going to be an issue.
Yeah, and I think that personal connection is very interesting and really clearly motivates you to do this research. Are there some questions that you'd like to ask in the future and answer in the future that in your research?
Well, regarding the insulin research I've been doing, the big question is, why is insulin so expensive? And in some of the preliminary research I've done, I don't think the typical explanations work. So when you hear about a drug that's very expensive, costing thousands of dollars that patients can't afford and need, you tend to think, okay, well, high prices, lack of availability, right? That's kind of the textbook definition of a monopoly, right? If there's one drug, it's protected by a patent, and that's why it's so expensive, right? And competition is kind of the way to mitigate that. Insulin's weird in that insulin's old, right? Insulin was not made in the last 20 years, right, when most patents tend to work. Insulin's over 100. And there's lots of different kinds of insulins. I personally take 2 kinds of insulins, right? Other diabetics take more than that. So if there's all these kinds of insulins, it's not a monopoly. What explains why it's so expensive? And the answer that I like to argue, or I think is the key component to this, is that insulin, from a regulatory standpoint, is a little bit different. So pharmaceuticals, they come out, they get approved, they get a patent lasting usually about 20 years. So high prices for 20 years, generics come in, price drops, then you get more accessibility, right? So, like I said, competition tends to help that process. Insulin is what you call a biological device. The way you regulate a biological device is you have an insulin, you add certain formularies and certain kinds of aspects to how you make it, how it's manufactured. If you change how it's manufactured or change the chemical components even slightly, right, that extends the patent because under FDA regulations, that's technically a new device. So what you end up with are a whole host of insulins, right, or just biological devices broadly, and they're all slightly different, but because they're all protected by a patent, they're all really expensive. Which means for a diabetic like me or for diabetics trying to use insulin, you can switch between the insulins, and to some degree that'll help you manage your condition, but you're ultimately paying the monopoly price. And the obvious corollary to that question is, well, how can you possibly regulate insulins to where the producer will still make them, diabetics get better access to them, but they're not outlandishly expensive, right? So the system works better for everyone.
Yeah, that's very important research, and I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me and talk about your research today. I'm really excited to find out what you find out in the future. So thank you for sitting down with me.
Always a pleasure, John.
Thank you.